This is a presentation of the Center for Advanced Study at the University of Illinois. For over 50 years, the Center for Advanced Study has brought together scholars from diverse disciplines and backgrounds, encouraging and rewarding excellence in all areas of academic inquiry at Illinois, one of the nation's premier public universities. For more information about this presentation and other center activities, please visit cas.illinois.edu.
Good afternoon. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible because I'm very excited, as I'm sure all of you are excited, about the opportunity that we have today to listen to a talk by a leading practitioner of journalism and perhaps even more interestingly, a witness to history, Stig Fredrikson. He is a specialist on Russia and Eastern Europe. He's traveled and reported all over the world. But Russia and Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn probably have a very special place in his professional career and, if I may say so, in his heart. Because the assignment which he was discharging in Moscow in the early 1970s as a very young reporter for news agencies in Scandinavia enabled him to first meet and then become involved with Solzhenitsyn's literary and social activities. So Stig Fredrikson is the author of two books in which Solzhenitsyn, Russia, and his own impressions and experiences of that country and that writer figure very prominently. He's an informed and active observer of Russia with some very intriguing insights and ideas on the way things are developing there now. So he's not only a Solzhenitsyn expert, he's not only a memoirist and a raconteur of experiences and stories about his time there in the 1970s, but he has plenty to tell us about the way he sees things developing in that part of the world right now and in the future. Finally, I'd just like to very briefly thank the very generous sponsors who contributed, made this Millicom event possible, including the School of Literatures, Cultures and Linguistics, the College of Media, Departments of History, Journalism, Political Science, as well as the Department of Slavic and Languages and Literatures. And one last kind of comment. I think we have about an hour for Stig's lecture, and then we'll have about 25 minutes or so for questions. And as I said, he's an absolutely fascinating commentator and sort of purveyor of insights on the world today, Russia and also other places. So, thank you, and Stig Fredrikson.
I will be using this microphone, so I hope that you all can hear me, right? Then that way I can move around a little bit easier. Thank you, Richard, for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to come here and give this lecture. It's a big honor for me to be here. I would like to ask you to come with me to Moscow in the early 1970s at some of the coldest of the years of the Cold War. I moved to Moscow early 1972. My wife Ingrid and I had got married the year before. I was 26 when we moved to Moscow. She was 25. We were expecting our first child. I was taking up an assignment as a foreign correspondent for the Swedish News Agency and the Scandinavian news agencies in Moscow. I had learned Russian at the Swedish Army Language School at Uppsala. So I suppose that was part of the reason why I was chosen to be a correspondent in Moscow, that I knew Russian. We came to Moscow, I think, quite well prepared, but I'm not sure that we really knew what we could expect. We moved into a foreigner's compound, the biggest of the foreigners' compounds in Moscow on Kutuzovsky Prospect. And we had a nice apartment there with Western standards in kitchen and bathroom. We had to assume that there were listening devices in the walls of the apartment. We had to assume that my telephone was tapped, of course, or bugged. We couldn't say anything in the apartment of a sensitive nature. We used to have these writing pads where you can write and then erase the writing when you lift up the screen. Or we could go out in the park or on the street if we wanted to talk something that the walls should not hear. We heard a story from a New Year's party at the French embassy in Moscow, where the ambassador, towards 12 o'clock, said that maybe on a solemn night like this, we should also raise a toast to our absent but nevertheless present friends. So they toasted, and 5 minutes later, a waiter came to and called the ambassador to the telephone and said, they say it's urgent. They say that the ambassador has to take the call. So he went and took the call. There was no voice. He just heard a sound. And then the call went dead. The telephone went dead. I got to know an American at the American embassy in Moscow, who told me that we have estimated that every foreigner in Moscow, on the average, keeps 17 Soviet citizens busy with just surveillance of the foreigners in Moscow. 17 Soviet citizens. It was, of course, difficult to work as a Western correspondent in Moscow in those days. My work was heavily restricted. We could move, in principle, in a 40-kilometer zone from the center of Moscow. But even in this 40-kilometer zone, there were closed areas that we could not go to, where there were scientific institutes or military industries. And of course, my travels in the Soviet Union were also very restricted. They had to be organized and approved of. So, of course, under those circumstances, I don't think it's strange that many Western correspondents cultivated the dissident story. Maybe we exaggerated the dissident story, but to see the dissidents was, in a way, our only way of working, like we were used to working. But it had to be, of course, on their conditions, to see them if they dared to meet a Western correspondent in their kitchen or in the street and interview them. And by the time I came to Moscow, I would say that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was by far the biggest name among the dissidents. He had received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1970. I got to Moscow in 1972. I would like now to show you a little bit from a documentary that I made in 1993 for Swedish television that tells the story of how I got to know Solzhenitsyn and got to help him as a courier. I want to put the years first in perspective so that you understand this, and also explain to you a little bit from this movie. This documentary was filmed in Moscow in 1993, and that was also the year when Solzhenitsyn, for the first time, revealed and wrote about the secret meetings I had with him in the 70s. This was 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. Solzhenitsyn had decided to move back to Moscow, which he did 1 year later in 1994. He came to Switzerland to give a lecture and to, as he said, say goodbye to Europe before he moved back to Moscow from Vermont, where he had spent his exile, or most of his exile, during 18 years in Vermont. I had begged him for an interview for several years, but he said, well, I will give you an interview when the time is ripe. And the time was ripe when he came to Europe in 1993, because he had written this, he had added a new chapter to his memoirs. His memoirs, the first part of it has the name The Oak and the Calf. And in the early 90s, he published first in the literary journal in Moscow, Novy Mir, and then as a book. He published a new chapter where he wrote about our meetings. And when that became published, the world, or at least in Sweden, it became a big thing that I had these meetings, but that was the first time when people had heard about it. And I decided to make this documentary. So we filmed in Moscow, and we did also an English language version of the documentary that Swedish television could sell abroad. So what you will see is first a very short little sequence when I meet and embrace Solzhenitsyn for the first time in almost 10 years in Switzerland in 1993. And then we move over to Moscow, and I tell the story of our secret meetings. There are a couple of short clips in Swedish. They were subtitles when we exported the film, but I couldn't get the subtitling in the copy I made. The first is in black and white, and there the secretary of the Swedish Academy announces the Nobel Prize in Literature to Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn in 1970, and he reads the citation, and it goes like this: for the ethical force with which he has pursued the indispensable traditions of Russian literature. That was the citation. Then there are two short clips in Swedish also with my editor at the Swedish News Agency, Hans Björkegren, who happened to be Solzhenitsyn's translator. He was a former correspondent also, my boss. He was now the foreign editor of the news agency, and he had translated into Swedish Solzhenitsyn's books, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Cancer Ward, In the First Circle, the books that he got the Nobel Prize for. And he tells in the documentary here how the Swedish Academy turned to him when they tried to arrange a ceremony in Moscow to give Solzhenitsyn the Nobel Prize there, because he had decided not to come to Stockholm in 1970 to receive the prize. He was afraid that he would not be allowed back into the country if he went to Stockholm. So the Swedish Academy turned to my editor and said, can your correspondent get in touch with Solzhenitsyn in Moscow and ask if the family needs anything for the ceremony we plan? So I got the address to his wife's apartment, and that is when I met him for the first time. Then the ceremony had to be canceled because the secretary of the academy was refused a visa to come to Moscow. Of course, the KGB didn't want this ceremony to take place because it would have been an anti-Soviet manifestation with a fiery speech by Solzhenitsyn and so on. The second short clip in Swedish is when my editor tells the story of how I came to Helsinki with Solzhenitsyn's Nobel lecture in my luggage. And I will tell you a little bit more about that later. But I think we can watch the documentary now with these explanations. So
Стиг! Стиг! Дорогой, здравствуйте. А, наконец-то, да?
Да, наконец.
Не в таких условиях мы встречались.
Нет,
Не в таких, нет. Все время так скрывали. А теперь уже совершенно свободно и открыто. Ну как хорошо. Ну вот
вы очень хорошо выглядите.
Да, ну слава Богу,
Да.
слава Богу. Еще пока держусь. Конечно, не так-то это легко.
By now, Solzhenitsyn and I have known each other for more than 20 years. Now that we meet again for the first time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I ask myself, does he, the author of the Gulag Archipelago, today feel that he finally defeated the Soviet system? And did he really believe in this development in those days, when we started meeting in secret in Moscow in 1972? The first time I saw Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was at a Shostakovich concert here at the Moscow Conservatory. That was on the 27th of March 1972, and I had just arrived in Moscow as correspondent for the Nordic news agencies. That meeting resulted only in an autograph on the back of the concert program. But not long after that, we established a more personal contact. And the reason was the plans of the Swedish Academy to arrange a Nobel Prize ceremony for Solzhenitsyn in Moscow, since Solzhenitsyn couldn't come to Stockholm to receive the prize himself.
Jaha, vem är svensk? Är du svensk? Ja, Svenska Akademin har just fattat ett beslut angående Nobelpriset i litteratur för i år. Och det har tilldelats den ryske författaren Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Motiveringen är för den etiska kraft varmed han fullföljt den ryska litteraturens omistliga traditioner.
I början av 1972 så blev jag uppringd av Vilhelm Moberg som hade fått ett brev på ryska från Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Han frågade om jag kunde översätta det, och brevet innehöll hälsningar till mig också. Jag hade ju översatt en hel del av Solzhenitsyn. Men brevet innehöll också hans adress i Moskva. Och den var på den tiden okänd för, tror jag, alla utländska korrespondenter i Moskva. Samtidigt så skickade vi på TT Stig Fredrikson som korrespondent till Moskva. Och han fick naturligtvis med sig den här adressen och, för att uppsöka Solzhenitsyn. Under våren så förekom också en mängd kontakter med Svenska Akademin. Karl Ranagirov, ständiga sekreteraren, hade planer på att överlämna Nobelinsignierna till Solzhenitsyn vid något slags ceremoni i Moskva.
My first real meetings with Solzhenitsyn and his second young wife Natalia took place here on Gorky Street in Moscow in her apartment. Solzhenitsyn at that time was living with the famous cellist Rostropovich at his dacha outside Moscow, since he didn't have the right to live in Moscow. But nevertheless, he spent a lot of time here in her apartment. And it was also in the apartment here that the planned Nobel Prize ceremony was going to take place. the invitation cards to the ceremony had already been sent out. But the secretary of the Swedish Academy, Dr. Girov, didn't get his visa. The ceremony had to be cancelled, and I got my first mission as the go-between for Solzhenitsyn and the rest of the world. First, to publish his statement with his reaction, and also to take out his speech that he had planned to give to the Swedish Academy for the Nobel Prize. This is how Solzhenitsyn himself writes about this in the new version of his book, his literary biography that has just been published in Russian.
And while all this was going on, Stig and I decided to meet outside the flat of the subway of the Belarusian station, which was my route to and from Rostropovich's dacha. We met at the end of April. In my pocket I had a film with my Nobel speech, which we had no other means of sending off, and it had to go to Sweden after all. I stood in a secluded spot, and he came along with his arm around his wife, Ingrid. I waited until they'd gone past, and then walked after them, while Alia approached from a different direction. Then I waited a bit longer and checked that no one was following them. Everything seemed to be all right, and then, when we caught up with them, all four of us walked along Leningradsky Prospect. Never before had there been anything special about that street, however much I went back and forth along it. But now my recollection is always the same. It was the last street they drove me along before I was exiled from Russia. During our conversation, I made my proposal. He accepted, and in a dark courtyard I handed the film over to him. In folklore, it brings luck if a pregnant woman is present when an agreement is made. But on this occasion we had two pregnant women, our two wives.
I slutet på april 1972 så åkte jag till Helsingfors för att vara med i ett möte med de nordiska nyhetsbyråernas utrikesredaktörer. Stig Fredrikson var vår gemensamma korrespondent då, och han kom också till Helsingfors. Jag tyckte att han var ovanligt återhållsam. Och så småningom kom det fram att han hade med sig material från Solzhenitsyn som han hade lagt in i en transistorradio. Materialet det var ett brev till Karl Girov och Solzhenitsyns Nobelföreläsning.
So from the spring of 1972 till February 74, when Solzhenitsyn was expelled, I had some 20 secret meetings with him here in Moscow, plus a few with his wife, Natalia, in order to receive letters, manuscripts, and messages for the West, and in order to give to him letters and messages that had come from his people in the West.
Throughout the autumn of 1972 and into the winter of 1973, our meetings continued, always in darkness, in dimly lit alleys and in courtyards near the Belarusian station. The time of the meetings was always the same, but we always decided on the date of the next one, plus a reserve date, before we parted company. And somehow it now dawned on me that this was absolutely indispensable, that I couldn't live without this. How had I been able to live for 9 years without direct personal contact with a Westerner? I discovered a way of maneuvering that I'd not had previously, a quick way of transferring this and that. And there was something to hand over and something to receive every time, small reels of film, new versions of text, or newly written ones.
This is the Kiev train station in Moscow. From the spring of 73, this is where we started meeting. Solzhenitsyn suggested that we change and meet here at the Kiev station instead of the Belarusian train station. And he also gave me in advance a map of where he was going to stand and how I was going to be walking in order to see him. And then, if everything was okay, how we should get in contact with each other. And from now on, we started meeting in the morning instead of in the evening.
And sometimes we met like that, in broad daylight one summer morning at the bustling station, and then in an adjoining street in a green arbor in a working-class district at the Studentskaya underground station. We were in full view for anyone to photograph or observe, easy to shadow. But then it was so long since we'd seen each other in daylight. For the first time he took pictures of me as well, but for himself, not for his work.
Today, in this place, the gazebo no longer exists where Aleksandr Isaievich was sitting that early morning in June when I took the pictures of him. In the fall of 1973, things started accelerating fast around Solzhenitsyn. In Leningrad, the KGB seized the manuscript of an unknown book by Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, and the woman who had revealed where the manuscript was hidden after long interrogation by the KGB hanged herself. Solzhenitsyn then counterattacked. He made protest statements, which I helped him publish, and through me, he also ordered his publishers in the West to start immediate publication of the Gulag Archipelago, because in the West there already were manuscripts of the book.
For exceptional situations, we also had a procedure worked out. I would ring Stig early in the morning before his Soviet secretary arrived. He recognized my voice and also Alia's immediately, and the call always meant we must meet this evening, time and place already agreed on. But what should we actually say on such an occasion? Naturally, the phone was tapped. So Stig suggested we should pretend to have rung the wrong number. Excuse me, is that the dry cleaners? Or, excuse me, is that the gastronome home delivery department? Oh, I see, it isn't, sorry. And that was enough for Stig to recognize my voice. But supposing the phone was out of order or occupied for a long time, or if Stig wasn't at home. But on the 4th of September, everything went smoothly. Both the so-called wrong number call among the suburban throng at the Leningrad station and the meeting itself. In the evening I travelled for a long time with 3 times the usual caution. From the dacha I walked along different streets and alleys, and on the underground I changed trains at stations that were rapidly emptying, like Krasnoserskaya, where the platform is quite bare and you can be sure of being alone.
At this time, the media campaign against Solzhenitsyn increased in the Soviet Union. The Gulag Archipelago was published in the West, and the book was a scattering attack on the whole Soviet system, not least by the main theme that it was Lenin and not Stalin who started the concentration camp, the labor camps, and the killings. Solzhenitsyn at this time no doubt became the Soviet Union's enemy #1. He was the most criticized and probably the most followed person. Nevertheless, we could continue our meetings, and when we met, it felt as to be in the quiet, in the eye of the storm.
Nevertheless, throughout that terrible last autumn, Stig and I managed our meetings safe and sound. In my hard-pressed situation, these meetings gave me irreplaceable space to breathe.
And this is a quote from a note I made after a meeting with him on the 10th of December 1973, on Solzhenitsyn's birthday. 1 hour's meeting, minus 20 degrees centigrade. He said goodbye to me as if it would be long before we see each other again, or as if we were never going to see each other again at all. He kissed me hard on both cheeks and talked about what could happen to him. I'm prepared for everything, he said. 2 years in jail, but no labor camp. That I can take, but not more. But we had one final meeting in Moscow, and that was on the 14th of January 1974. On that day, Pravda printed a vicious attack on Solzhenitsyn, and in between the lines, in that article there was a threat to expel him. This is a note I made after that meeting. Hard to imagine that he can be so glad in such harmony that he can joke and laugh. No, he had not read Pravda today, but if we live till the 31st, I think we can make it, he said. And in his memoirs, this is how Solzhenitsyn describes that meeting.
Stig's and my last secret meeting was on the 14th of January 1974, on the same day that Pravda launched a big press campaign against me. Among the various possible alternatives, you could already discern the option of their not arresting me, but banishing me to the West. In that case, I thought I would settle in Norway. But I wanted to keep Stig with me. He was a good friend. So I said to him that if this happened, and he were to suffer as a result of his contact with me, he should not fear deportation from the Soviet Union or a ruined career as a correspondent. I said, be my secretary in Norway instead, secretary and general intermediary with the outside world. In him too this thought had taken shape, and he liked the idea. In a doorway where no one could see us, we embraced and bid each other farewell. Our next meeting was planned for the 14th of February, 2 days after my arrest.
After Solzhenitsyn was exiled, and after he was reunited with his family, we met a couple of times in Norway and in Switzerland. And after the Solzhenitsyns moved to Vermont in the United States, I was invited once in April '84 to spend Easter with them there. We have also been writing regularly to each other. But now that Aleksandr Isaievich sits down for a television interview here in Switzerland, it's the first time in almost 10 years that we see each other again.
Now follows a 40-minute long interview with Solzhenitsyn, but it's only in Russian, so I will not play that now. Well, there are many things I would like to discuss with you after this film, and I can imagine that you have a few questions. There are a few remarks I would like to make first. The Nobel lecture that he asked me to take to Stockholm during that first secret meeting in April '72 was not a text, but a film. He had photographed the text of his Nobel lecture with his camera, and he gave me 9 black and white negatives with the text in an envelope. And when I came back to the apartment, I cut the film in stripes and pulled them in plastic, put them in plastic, and then I took a little tin tube that you use for headache tablets and emptied it, and I put that plastic with the film inside the tin tube. And I took my transistor radio, unscrewed the back of it. I took out the batteries, and in the room where the batteries were, the tin tube fitted exactly. So I screwed together the transistor again, and I put the transistor radio in my suitcase and took the train to Helsinki, where I was going to see my editors at an arranged meeting. The border control was not especially particularly harsh that time. They checked my documents and so on, but apparently they didn't know what I had in the suitcase, so that went fine. And I came to Helsinki. I saw my editor, whom you saw here, and I said to him, I have mail from Moscow here in my suitcase. And I explained that I had Solzhenitsyn's Nobel lecture. And then he decided that we should continue to Stockholm and see the people at the Swedish Academy, and they got the film. And it was published all over the world in the fall of 1972. And I remember the headlines were that, at least in Sweden, they said Solzhenitsyn's Nobel lecture reaches us in secret ways, so on. And but the thing was that this lecture that he had planned to hold in 1970, had he gone to Stockholm, was very powerful, very moving, a very strong text that made news all over the world. This was the first time that Solzhenitsyn used the word Gulag in that speech, in that Nobel lecture. And the whole lecture was a celebration or an homage to those who died in the prison camps and did not survive. Intellectuals, writers, and Solzhenitsyn wrote that to all those who died in the prison camps and were thrown naked with just a number around the big toe of the feet in a mass grave. It is to them that this lecture was dedicated, while he had survived and therefore had a mission to witness about the conditions in the camps. But I returned then just to Moscow, and we continued our meetings. And Solzhenitsyn, of course, saw that this was a reliable way of breaking his isolation and carry on his fight. I remember that I took myself out at least one more thing. I was flying from Moscow that time, and he had given me a large envelope full of photographs, pictures, original pictures from his life, from early childhood. There were a few pictures of him in the prison, the prison clothes. And this was going to be a pictorial autobiography in the West, and it was published in the West. And this big envelope with these invaluable photographs, I taped on my back when I was going through the airport, because I thought that maybe if they frisk me, they would feel me here, but maybe they will not feel me here. That was probably very naive, but it went well that time also. And of course, then I realized that this cannot go on like this. I didn't leave Moscow more than twice a year for summer vacation and for Christmas. And the size of what I got from Solzhenitsyn grew every time. Well, there were lots of letters and envelopes and tapes and films, and he also had a lawyer in Switzerland, in Zurich, Dr. Habe, and he was his representative when it came to publishing in the West and all the contracts and so on. So there was a lot of mail coming from Zurich to Solzhenitsyn in Moscow. And at that time, we were saved by the Norwegian embassy in Moscow. I was also representing the Norwegian news agency, and the Norwegians did not discriminate me as a Swede. They considered me a full-time Norwegian correspondent, and the Norwegian correspondents in Moscow were allowed to use the diplomatic courier, the diplomatic pouch, privately. The Swedish embassy did not allow us Swedish correspondents even to send. I couldn't send a letter to my parents in Sweden telling them how we really were doing in Moscow through the embassy, because they had forbidden that. And formally, I mean, they were right. The diplomatic pouch was supposed to be for the diplomats. But the Norwegians felt that Moscow was difficult enough to give the correspondents some help. So I could send everything I got from Solzhenitsyn. I put in different envelopes, wrote different addresses to good friends in Stockholm on the envelopes, and went to the Norwegian embassy, and they put them in the diplomatic pouch and sent them on to Stockholm, and vice versa. And Solzhenitsyn called this the Great Northern Route, Veliki Severny Put, and that was his lifeline for these 2 years. I still every time thank the Norwegian embassy. I published this book in 2004 in Sweden called Alexander's Courier, where I tell the story of our meetings. It was reviewed by a former Swedish ambassador to Moscow, and it was very favorably reviewed, but he also said that, because I apparently touched something raw there, he said Fredrickson could have mentioned in his book that NATO was a member of, that Norway was a member of NATO, but Sweden was not a member of NATO. So, so it didn't cost them anything to help him, was the meaning. But why did I say yes to him in the first place? That's a question I've been asking myself, of course, many times. But really, I don't think I had any choice, and I didn't really hesitate that first evening in April '72. Maybe I was too young, and maybe I was too naive to be afraid or to think of the risks. But I remember that to me it was an enormous adventure, and it was extremely exciting that he asked me, that I got this contact with him. You have to understand that Solzhenitsyn by this time was really a big name. He was the biggest dissident, of course, but he was also a very big name all over the world through his books and through his criticism of the Soviet system. And no other Western correspondent had any contact with him. But I also think that I felt that it was so unfair that he was so isolated and couldn't communicate with the outside world, thanks to the KGB. I came from a country where we take all these freedoms for granted. Just a simple thing like sending a letter through the mail without having KGB or the censorship taking it. And if I could help him, why shouldn't I help him? It's also important for me to say that while this was going on, I never thought that I would never ever be able to tell the story. While we were living in Moscow in the 70s, I did not foresee the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. We saw Moscow as a city in a state of constant alert. Military personnel, uniformed people on the city. I assumed that the KGB had all the resources in the world. We experienced the Soviet Union as very repulsive, but very mighty, very powerful. I mean, this was the years when the Soviet Union acquired superpower status through their nuclear armaments. And I thought that this would have to remain a secret forever, at least as long as I lived. I remember that when we moved back to Sweden in 1976, I said to myself that I should probably write down what I have experienced to document it and put it in an envelope and write to be opened after my death or something like that. And then all this happened. So, and it's also, I think, important for me to say that I didn't do this to have a good story to tell, because I thought that I would never be able to talk about it. I had, of course, problems with my role as a reporter, as a journalist. That is a thing we could talk about a long time. A journalist should not become an actor himself. A journalist should report, tell what she or he sees, and write about it or tell about it. I became an actor myself, which in a way violates a ground rule for journalists. My only defense is that maybe sometimes there are things more important than journalism if you have a chance to make a contribution to something. Maybe there are things more important than journalism. And also, I didn't do anything behind the back of my news agency. My editors knew about this, and it would have been terrible for me if I had got expelled from the Soviet Union and they had not known about it. The Norwegian embassy, of course, also knew what was in the letters that the envelopes that I came with to them. The agreement I had with the Swedish agency was that when Solzhenitsyn gave me news, which he did almost every time we met, he gave me statements, press releases, and they were flash news all over the world. I went with these statements to my colleagues in the compound. Everybody was living close to each other. I went to the AP, I went to UPI, I went to Reuters, I went to the New York Times, and I gave them Solzhenitsyn's statements. And I didn't reveal to them that I came directly from Solzhenitsyn, but they trusted that this was real stuff and that could be printed. And the agreement I had with my news agency was that they first took a short version from Reuters or AP, a flash, an urgent telegram. And then an hour later, I would come with a longer, fuller version, because of course, I had access to the whole statement. And they knew that, and they waited. They sent out a short flash, and then my longer version. But in that way, I didn't get the attention on myself as the source of a new statement by Solzhenitsyn. The only crime I committed as a reporter, as a correspondent, was that I refrained from a scoop myself. I let others have the scoops. On one occasion, during one of the secret meetings, Solzhenitsyn offered me an interview, and I said no. I said no, I declined. And he was very surprised because he knew that if I interviewed him, it would become big news. But I said no because I didn't want to get expelled from the Soviet Union. I thought I would be expelled immediately if I published an exclusive interview with Solzhenitsyn. And I didn't want to get expelled. Besides, I mean, that would have been the end of the secret meetings. Then another point, another remark, why didn't they catch us? Why didn't they find out about our secret meetings? In that interview in '93 in Switzerland, that was my first question to Solzhenitsyn. And he said, Stig, even in the most complete organizations, there are incompetent people. Plus, we were so smart, he said. And he had a very nice smile on his face, very satisfied when he said, we were so smart. With these precautions, and of course with his traveling, he could. When we met at 8 o'clock in the evening, as I said, he would travel he would travel all day. First on the commuter train from Zhukovka, where Rostropovich lived, jump from commuter train to commuter train, then switch over to the metro, travel on the metro for several hours till he felt that he had thrown off his shadows. And we didn't have anything, those notes I had written that I quoted here in the movie, I mean, they were in Swedish and there were no names and nothing that could identify that as being from a meeting with Solzhenitsyn. So we had everything in our heads. We knew what time of the day, we knew where to meet, we had the reserve date for the reserve date, and so on. But up till today, I still don't know if they knew anything about us. I am sure, though, that it is wrong to assume that maybe they knew and let it happen. I have got the question, do you think that maybe there were some liberal elements in the KGB that knew about this and saw between the fingers? And I said, no, that's impossible. There were no liberal elements in the KGB. I mean, if they had known about the secret meetings, they would have stopped us, definitely. In 1993, I had a chance to interview the last head of the KGB before December 91, Vadim Bakatin. He became head of the KGB after the coup in Moscow in August 91. So he was Gorbachev's last head of the KGB. And he told me in 93 that Gorbachev himself had asked Bakatin to try to find out what there was in the KGB archives about the harassment or the persecutions of Solzhenitsyn. And they did an investigation and came back to Gorbachev and said, we have found out that everything in the archives of KGB about Solzhenitsyn from the 70s was burnt, destroyed in July 1990, when the democratization of the Soviet Union was accelerating and the responsible within the KGB started fearing that they would have to answer for what they did in the 70s against the dissidents. So they decided to wipe out all traces. And Bakatin said to me that they burnt 105 volumes of Solzhenitsyn material in the archives. He said it was the volume of a truck, he said, 105 volumes, and it's all burnt. There is nothing left. The only thing he had found out was that the KGB had a code name for Solzhenitsyn. They called him Spider among the agents of the KGB. I just want to conclude by explaining a little bit to you about one thing that may have intrigued you, the plans for me to become Solzhenitsyn's private secretary. It's true that there were such plans, and I had said yes to that. Solzhenitsyn had said that I need someone to be my eyes and my ears in the exile towards the surrounding world. And I actually went to Zurich, where they ended up the first year of exile, to talk about my job as Solzhenitsyn's private secretary. And I saw it as, I wanted to see to it that Solzhenitsyn behaved correctly when he came to the West, that he frequented the right circles, so to say. I wanted him to have also the correct information about the West. And I saw myself as the filter so that he didn't end up in the wrong circles and got, of course, a favorable impression of the West. Because he had said, my eyes and my ears. I remember, and there was also a discussion of the conditions for my work. Salary, vacation, days of vacation, pension, social benefits, and so on. And he wrote to me after that and said, yes, don't worry, you will have a salary which is not less than what you have today. Don't worry about that. But on the other hand, do you think you need all these other things? I mean, if you start working for me, you have to realize that you have to do it in the Russian way and not the Western way. And that means working all the time and having no days off or anything like that. But there were also these ideological differences between us. I remember from that visit to Zurich that he had an enormous lot of letters that had been sent to him right after his exile. This was just after, and he had got these letters of admiration from many people, but I remember especially from rather right-wing circles in West Germany and from publishers in Germany, very, very right-wing. And I warned him against being too friendly with these people, because I was afraid that would ruin his reputation in the West. And then he said to me, I see nothing wrong with these people. I don't see why you warn me against them. They make a very valuable contribution in the fight against the Soviet Union, he said. Fine. But when then I went back to Moscow, and I got a letter from him where he broke the engagement. He wrote to me and said, I've been thinking this over, and there are too many differences of opinion between us. This will not work. A close cooperation like that is, in a way, like a marriage. And you should not get into a marriage if you don't think it will work. And today, of course, I am very glad that we never tried it. But it would never have worked. But at that time, I was very bitter. And I said, I wrote back to him, more or less, saying more or less that if you want to make a fool of yourself in the West, fine, it's up to you. I was prepared to help you, and so on, so on. And then I thought that was the end, more or less, of my relation with Solzhenitsyn. And because he also wrote to me and said, what I see in the West makes me very gloomy, very pessimistic. The West is collapsing. The West is too weak towards the Soviet Union. I think the West is going to meet the same fate as Russia around the Russian Revolution and so on. And I wrote back and said, I'm not so sure, but we will see who is right. I believe, well, today at least I'm glad that I never compromised with my views and my defense of our political system with democracy and pluralism and multi-party system in order to please him. But we took up the contacts again after a few years, and I was a correspondent for Swedish television in Washington for 4 years in the 80s, and then, as I said here in the film, my wife and I were invited to Vermont one Easter in '84, and we spent the Easter holiday with the Solzhenitsyns in Vermont, and I remember we had a wonderful Easter meal. Solzhenitsyn, Aleksandr Isayevich, took a small shot of vodka, and then he suddenly rose and left the table and went back to work on Easter. He had built himself a big house for himself and his family, and another big house next to it where he wrote. And he wrote the book, The Red Wheel, those years, a 7,000 pages volume about the years in Russia from 1914 to 1917. And I remember that when he rose and said goodnight and went back to work, it was as if the atmosphere became much easier. His wife relaxed, his mother-in-law relaxed, the boys relaxed, and we relaxed. And his wife is 21 years younger than he is. And she was during all these years, she was his most loyal and most valuable collaborator in his works. But she also had a need to be a little bit less serious sometimes. So when he had gone back to work, we relaxed and we started gossiping about things and talking about things not all that serious. But when we visited them in Vermont, he also showed me his writer's house. He worked on 3 floors with the red wheel. On the first floor, on the ground floor, he collected all the documents, books, letters, documents about these years. He had asked, when he was exiled, he had asked all the Russians all over the world to send him material, and he had got a lot. So on the ground floor, he had all the documents. On the second floor, he had started excerpting from the documents things and making sketches about how he was going to proceed. On the third floor, he was actually writing the book. So he worked himself up to the third floor, where he was writing standing all the time. When all this was going on in Moscow with the secret meetings, I saw Solzhenitsyn as the incredibly courageous fighter against the Soviet system. He waged a one-man war against the Soviet system. He also demanded freedom of expression, individual freedoms. He encouraged the Soviet people to stand up against the hypocrisy of the Soviet system. So my conclusion from all this was, of course, that Solzhenitsyn must be a Democrat, with my definition of democracy. He was fighting the Soviet system, communism, the evil system. So he must embrace my democracy. But only when we started talking in Zurich and the years after did I understand that that was not the case. He criticized the West for the weakness, lack of moral values, consumerism, and things like that. And that I could understand. Then, when he moved back to Moscow in 1994 to live his last years in Moscow, he started criticizing also the democratic Russia that was developing at that time. And I made an interview with him in 1998, just before his 80th birthday. Actually, I said here in the documentary that it was the 10th of December, the Nobel Day. His birthday was the 11th of December, the day after the Nobel Day. I did this interview with him in December 1998, and he was very critical of everything that was happening in Russia at that time, Yeltsin's Russia. And of course, I could understand much of the criticism against this raw capitalism that was taking place, the oligarchs who became richer and richer, and the majority of the people became poorer and poorer. He also, of course, criticized the new commercial culture that was invading Russia at that time. But eventually, I said to him, towards the end of the interview, but Aleksandr Isayevich, you have to admit that it's better today in Russia in 1998 than it was during the Soviet times. I mean, today you have a democratic Russia growing, you have free elections, you have a multi-party system, and then he just sighed and very heavily and said, Stig, you ask me to choose between pesticide and cholera. Which is worse? Which is worse, he said. Don't tell me what it was like in the Soviet times, because I was their best critic of the Soviet time. But it is as bad now as it was during the Soviet Union. Then I started to understand what he really feared. He feared that Russia in 1998 would run into the same fate as the Soviet Union: dissolution, anarchy, collapse of the state. And only with Putin did Solzhenitsyn see some relief, some change of course for the better. So Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn became a Putin supporter because Putin re-established a measure of stability, law and order in society, and took back power in a steady grip in the Kremlin, did away with free elections and competing parties in Russia, and stood up for Russia's interest towards NATO and towards the United States, defended Russia's sovereignty, and said to the West that don't advance your positions any longer towards Russia. Solzhenitsyn said, I remember one interview he gave, he said, NATO plans to encircle Russia and defeat it. I think that what Putin and Solzhenitsyn have in common is sort of an ambition to try to save Russia as they see it. And the democracy that Solzhenitsyn, as Solzhenitsyn defined it, was a democracy based on Russian traditions, Russian history, and that is not our Western democracy. People can have democracy on the grassroots level. They can have their own local affairs and decide upon, but Russia needs a strong man, a strong hand in the top. So therefore, Solzhenitsyn felt that his last years were a little bit calmer than the 90s. And I will end by showing you a short 3-minute excerpt from an interview I did with him in May 2008, a little over 2 months before he died. He died on the 3rd of August, and this interview was done on the 22nd of May. He was very weak then, and the condition was that I could ask him 3 questions. And he knew the questions in advance. I was going to ask him 2 questions about the book in the first circle, because Swedish television was going to show a filmatization of the book that had been made for Russian television and shown on Russian television, and now Swedish television was going to show this series in 10 installments on the book. And my 3rd question was, how is Russia doing today? This is his answer to that question. I will translate to it. I will translate to you later. But let's just look at Solzhenitsyn in May 2008, 2.5 months before he died, answering the question, how is Russia doing today?
Вам скоро исполнится 90 лет. Как, по-вашему, поживает Россия сегодня? Я взял у вас интервью 10 лет назад.
Было.
И вы тогда сказали, что плохо было в 98 году с Россией. И было плохо в советские времена, и было плохо в 98 году. А 10 лет спустя, сегодня, как поживает Россия?
Тут вообще в общественных явлениях России как бы отражалась картина, как это бывает в природе. В природе смена обстановки приносит сильный, не просто воздух, ветер, ураган, который приводит все в хаос. Вот так наше общество было в хаосе, начиная с 1985 года. Все открыто и непонятно, что делать. Все вот так тряслось, все запуталось. Поэтому я так и говорил, было очень тяжело. Жизнь, да, была При коммунизме одна беда, а тут была беда хаоса, беда расстройства, безответственности. Каждый хотел делать, что хотел. Такая была обстановка. Но как в природе, после урагана постепенно наступает, природа требует какого-то порядка. Какой-то порядок должен быть. И он наступает неизбежно. Так и сейчас. Я не скажу, что у нас сейчас светлый порядок. Нет, у нас еще много недостатков. Но все-таки жизнь похожа на как бы нормальное, естественное повседневное течение. Не так, что «а что будет завтра?» Вот что завтра будет не похоже на сегодня. Такого нет. И завтра очень похоже на сегодня. И сегодня похоже на вчера. Но более ровное течение – это все-таки спокойнее людям жить. Люди привыкают к этому новому направлению, вживаются в него, перестраивают себя, на что-то рассчитывают, на какое-то будущее, будет ли оно светлым или не будет. Конечно, каждый хочет для себя и для своей семьи, и для своего народа по возможности лучшего. Вот так и живем.
My follow-up question was that I tried to ask a more political question. Then he immediately said, no, I don't want to talk politics. And so we recorded about 8 minutes of interview, and then he said he was too weak to continue. But as you can hear, he was fully lucid. He was weak physically, but his head was clear and he was lucid. And he could talk about this book in the first circle that he started writing in the 50s. What is said here was that he used a metaphor from nature. He said that with Russia, it has been like it happens in nature. We had chaos starting in 1985. It was as if a hurricane had gone over our society and over our nation, wreaking havoc. And during communism, we had one evil. During the 90s, or from 85, we had another evil, the evil of the threat of chaos, dissolution of the society. And as happens always, inevitably in nature, after a hurricane, there comes a calmer, more quiet period. And that is what is happening now in Russia, where people can have more trust in tomorrow and start believing that the children will have a better tomorrow. We have a lot of deficiencies. Not all problems are solved, he stressed, but life has gone into a more quiet, normal, everyday pace. People don't have to worry about tomorrow the way they had to do when there was chaos in society. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Stig.
I should raise this for you.
Oh, that's all right. I think people can. Thank you. Just one point. The book by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, in which the chapter about Stig Fredrikson is included, is in The Invisible Allies, and it was published in the United States in 1996, and we actually have it in the university library. So those of you who are interested, we can order it online. But there's a whole chapter there about Stigs. Anyway, we have some time for questions, and please feel free. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about personal consequences to you had you been found. There would have been the expulsion, but were there other consequences that you or your family would have suffered?
I thought while this was going on that the worst that could happen to me was expulsion, as you say. I had an experience after this book came out in Sweden. I was riding on the bus in Stockholm one day when an old man came and sat next to me and said, "Can we talk?" And he said, "I have just read your book. And I have to say, you did something incredibly courageous when you helped Solzhenitsyn. But I don't think you realize what danger you were in and what risks you were running. Because I have been in the Gulag myself," he said. I spent 5 years in the Gulag. He was a Hungarian Jew who had ended up after the Second World War in Soviet captivity and then in the prison camps and been released and ended up in Sweden. He said, with my background and with my experience, I think, had they known about the meetings, they would have grabbed you and let you disappear, he said. So that made me think, of course. But I said to him, but that was it was the 70s, and do you think something that could happen? He said, yes, I think they could have taken you and just let you disappear.
Thank you for a great presentation. I was curious about after you wrote your book and all the information came out about your relationship with Solzhenitsyn and even spiriting his Nobel Prize speech out of the country so that it could be printed by the Academy. When all this became public information, did your colleagues, other journalists, criticize you for being an activist or an advocate and breaking the rules of journalism by being a neutral recipient of information rather than a purveyor of photographs and letters and as well as the speech? And if so, what was your response?
It became public knowledge only in 1993, not before that. So then it was already 20 years ago that it happened. When the television program was shown on Swedish television in 1993, that's when my story became known in Sweden. And then there was also discussion after when this book came out. Not really. There were some comments to that effect, that I should not have stepped over and become active. But most of the reviews and most of the comments after this became public was that I did the right thing, because, as I said, sometimes there are things more important than journalism. And that was the overall view, I think.
After he initially went to Norway, why did he choose Cavendish, Vermont, to settle in and do his writing?
I think Norway was, from the beginning, a far shot. It was not really serious. He soon found out that Norway was too isolated and too far away. Then they spent a year in Zurich, and they got fed up with the Swiss bourgeois mentality. But when we had this discussion about a job as a secretary, he said, I see the Swiss here, they take Saturday off, they take Sunday off, and what kind of people are they? And so they didn't like city life in Zurich and the bourgeois mentality. I think they really liked it in Vermont. They liked there was a semblance in nature with Russia, the winter, summers, and they had a huge piece of land and a beautiful forest, and I think they liked it there. It gave him peace to write, sit and write.
Thank you.
What was your reaction to Harvard speech by Solzhenitsyn?
What is my reaction to the Harvard speech? Well, that's when he made a fool of himself. I mean, I don't, that is not fair, of course, to say, but that's when that happened, what I had feared would happen with him in the West, and which I, in my naivete, was trying to avoid or stop when I was supposed to work for him. You of course know what the climate was in the West in the 70s, a leftist climate, and his criticism of the West did not fall well at all. The thing is that he always thought that he had nothing new to learn about the West. He thought that he knew the West and how it worked, how it functioned, and he didn't have to learn anything about our way of doing things. And I mean, that's the way he was as a person, as a man. There was no one who could teach him anything. I sometimes tell the story when I had a secret meeting with him actually in October '73 when Kissinger and Le Ducteau had just received the Nobel Peace Prize and shared it. And there were protests in the West against Kissinger. But I met Solzhenitsyn that night, and he said, "Have you heard that Le Ducteau from North Vietnam has gotten half of the Peace Prize? That's terrible." But to my luck, I heard that 2 courageous people in the Norwegian Nobel Committee resigned from the committee in protest. And I said, yes, that's true. They left in protest, but they left in protest against Kissinger. And he said, "Is that true?" So, I mean, he had his own view, and nobody could teach him anything.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'd like to thank Stig once again. Thank you so much for us.
Thank you.